Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Blood is running down the cobbles of the Via Dolorosa in ancient Jerusalem. A nightmare of violence over the last month has overcome occupied Palestine. In place of the normal levels of attrition, of targeted killings, and near starvation being suffered under illegal Israeli annexation, occupation, and siege.
After almost half a century of occupation during which the world has achieved precisely nothing in bringing it to an end, the Palestinians appear to have risen up to try and shake it off. In other words, the Third Intifada appears to have broken out, and thousands will be outside the Israeli embassy in London today in solidarity with the occupied people.
Our first guest has peerless knowledge and experience in reporting on this struggle. He's a former foreign editor of The Guardian and now the editor of the highly respected Middle East Eye, David Hearst. He joins us now. David, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. First of all, is it an intifada? Who has the power to declare it so? Or is it just that if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck?
Well, with intifadas, as you know, from the first and second intifadas, you can only really tell after they've broken out, and sometimes quite a long time after they've broken out. But I think, yes, this is an intifada. It's an intifada because, not because of the number of deaths necessarily, because there were many more, there were hundreds more in the first 2 days of the second intifada, but because there's now a real change of attitude. It comes after the death of the two-state solution. It comes after the death of any form of peace process. The peace process was actually a settler process. It wasn't a peace process. And now you've got these incursions on Al-Aqsa and the Al-Aqsa compound, and people are saying, enough. We've just had enough. And this is coming from the people. It's coming from the streets. It's not coming from the leadership. And that's another important factor. This isn't being controlled. It is becoming, despite the Palestinian leadership and despite divisions between Hamas and Fatah.
The first and second intifadas had semi-official, in the first case, actual official sanction from the Palestinian leadership, then President Arafat. What's the attitude of the current Palestinian leadership to the events we're all watching, at least if we watch RT?
Well, there's a good Latin expression for what Abbas is doing. It's festina lente, which means hurrying slowly. He is speaking in some very fine words to the UN Assembly about non-violent protests, about resistance. What he's actually doing on the ground is, in many cases, actually helping the occupation by his security preventative forces, which are stopping the demonstrations from going towards the lines of Israeli troops. And he's still arresting people, and there is still torture in jail.
Well, perhaps come back to where all this leaves him. As we both know, his term has long expired. I think 3/4, you reported it, I think 3/4 or more of the Palestinians want him to step down. But does that seem to suggest that this is a generational shift, that the youth that are on the streets are in fact the leaders of this intifada?
Well, they themselves say, we've had enough of your words, and we're going to take things into our own hands. Now that doesn't mean, and they're making individual decisions to pick up a dagger and to attack. Now that doesn't mean that they haven't thought about it, and that doesn't mean that there isn't real passion behind it. But it does mean that these are individual decisions that are being taken. And at some point, there's going to be a real challenge to the Palestinian leadership as to actually what they do about it.
Yes. Sorry, but you say the individuals, but they must organize themselves in some way on the streets or even online.
Well, that's a very good point. There is evidence of an online campaign, an online communication. But according to all the evidence so far, what's making it particularly difficult for the Israelis and certainly for their security organizations is that most of the people involved in these attacks have no known affiliations. They don't have criminal records, they don't appear on any files. That's what I mean by not being organized.
Well, I've lived long enough to have known the Palestinians when Fatah was completely hegemonic, support of about 80% of the people, the rest being leftists of various kinds. Then the emergence of the Islamist trend, which competed with and then overtook Fatah. But now we're in a situation, aren't we, where most Palestinians are probably not supporters of either of those two behemoths, and as you say, are probably not affiliated with any organization. Thus are lone wolves, and thus are very difficult to predict in terms of the Israeli security response.
But what they do want, and I think there was one very, very telling photograph where there was a young woman in a keffiyeh and in jeans giving stones to a Hamas youth with a green headband. They were combining forces, and I think really what they want to do on the ground, and this could be too optimistic of me, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence for it, they want a new leadership and they want a combined leadership. Because the other thing that Fatah and Hamas have been doing, particularly Fatah, they've been stopping a unity agreement from working. And I think the message from the streets is we need a new leadership and we need a unified leadership.
Now, Netanyahu has his own problems on his right. He's got people camped outside his door saying that, unbelievably though it sounds, he's not being brutal enough in the crackdown. Will that begin to change his attitude to the events, or is there a danger in any way to his continuing leadership?
Well, he is a political survivor, and however right-wing we think he is, he does actually represent the mainstream of, and that's that's been his forte. He's the Mr. Centre Ground, and he keeps shifting to the right as the centre ground shifts to the right, but he's one there. And so he can always turn around to the Israeli public and say, if not me, who else? So he's got that hold. That being said, he's in an extremely difficult position at the moment because let's say, for instance, how he attacks Abbas and how he attacks Ramallah. He desperately wants to say, yes, you're inciting the violence. It's because of you that these kids are going out onto the streets. You're lying on the one side, and on the other hand, he wants to keep the Palestinian Authority in place for very good reason, because they're suppressing dissent in the West Bank. So he's torn between these two completely different forces.
Now, there's a consensus inside this studio that the two-state solution is dead. It doesn't exist, that consensus, though, everywhere, or even in most places. A very large number of people still cling to the possibility of a solution with a West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem state. Tell the viewers, why that is dead.
Well, it's dead if you walk or go or drive between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, or if you try and go on the road from Ramallah to northwards. Just look around you. See how the whole landscape has changed. There are now 600,000 settlers in a land in that 22% of Palestine that they were talking about. 200,000 of them in East Jerusalem. The atmosphere has changed. Is there an Israeli leader who can get all these people back? Does the Green Line exist? Most of the things that we're talking about are dead and gone. There are so many facts on the ground.
They belonged 20 years ago in the Oslo optimism.
Yeah, that's right, and they're not there anymore. And I don't think there is an Israeli leader capable of basically dismantling all that infrastructure over all the roads, the system of water, in whichever way you try and manage it. If you just look on a map, if you just look around you, if you look at the lights on the hills, which are all the lights of settlers, there's no way that that's going to go.
So what happens next?
Well, there's going to be, I think, a very big conflagration. I think I say this with absolutely no glee. I'm not wishing for anything, for any death of either any Jew or any Arab. But unfortunately, and alas, the situation only changes through violence. And historically, that is actually what's happened. And we are going to go through, I think, a very violent period. It's certainly not unifying all the Palestinians. It's getting a new group of people involved in the action. We haven't talked about this, but in previous intifadas, they were mainly carried out from the West Bank and from Gaza. This intifada, I think, the epicenter of it will be East Jerusalem, but there are also who are Jerusalemites, and as you know, they have a special ID pass that can be taken away from them now. But it will also involve the 48 Palestinians, the Palestinians of 1948, in the northern villages. Now, the longer this goes on, the more their so-called loyalty to the Israeli state will be questioned, and all sorts of really nasty things could happen. Livni has already talked about this, Lieberman has talked about this. They've talked about the thing called static transfer, which is where you basically say that your village or your town belongs to another country and you're no longer part of Israel. Either they will be stripped of Israeli citizenship. That's one proposal. And you could have curfews, military curfews. This will be, I think, quite a long struggle. I think what the world has got to do is to sit up and say, how many struggles do you want these people to endure? How long? Israel cannot do this. Israel cannot keep on. And I think we've really got to question the EU, Cameron, Obama, all our own leaders, and say, listen, mates, what are you going to do about this? What pressure are you applying to Israel? How, for instance, are we still, with this level of violence, still discussing the question of labelling of goods from the occupied territories? I mean, it's obscene.
Well, lots of trouble ahead, that's for sure. And if we're depending on David Cameron for a solution, I fear there will not be one. David Hearst, thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Coming up after this break, a guest close to my own heart, a survivor of the fascistic US organized massacre of millions 50 years ago in my own country of Indonesia. Don't miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. 50 years ago exactly, a US organized military coup led by fascist generals overthrew the elected government. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In Indonesia, they imprisoned the President Sukarno and hundreds of thousands of others, and then massacred perhaps 3 million more.
Sukarno's crime was to be the leader of an oil-rich nation which didn't toe the US line in world affairs and sought instead non-alignment, independence and equality. The murdered were described as communists, though most of them were not. And the Indonesian Communist Party, once the third largest after the Soviet Union and China, was physically exterminated and remains illegal to this day.
Carmel Budiardjo came from a Jewish anti-fascist family in London who married an Indonesian man, became an Indonesian citizen, and then worked at the Indonesian Foreign Office under Sukarno. Her husband was imprisoned by the generals, and so was she for 3 years long, after which her citizenship was withdrawn and she was deported back to the UK. For 50 years now, she's been campaigning for justice in Indonesia and the region, and she joins us now.
Carmel, tell us what happened in September 1965 in Indonesia.
At the end of September, in fact, later, almost into October, there was an incident when a group of generals were killed. When I woke up that morning, I should say, I was living in a very quiet residential area of Jakarta. But when I woke up that morning, there were tanks going up and down the street, and it was very frightening. I thought, oh, well, something has happened here. I didn't understand. I put on the radio, and it was not beaming the usual program. Had been obviously taken over by somebody else. The army then declared that these killings were perpetrated by the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI. There was no proof, no evidence. What actually happened there has never been investigated exactly who was responsible for these killings. And as a result of that, they began a huge crackdown on anybody who had any relationship with the PKI. The PKI at that time had something like, I don't know, 3 million members, and many mass organizations supporting. So you could say it was a movement of about 15 million people in a country, of course, at that time of about 180 million people. So the crackdown came, and I happened to be a member of an organization that was seen as being part of this group of organizations. Of course, I knew nothing about what had happened, except that it did happen. I didn't know why or what was it all about. We were all declared to be involved. Everybody was involved. I was involved. Terlibat, the Indonesian word is terlibat. As if I was involved. I don't know involved in what. What did I do? So almost immediately my husband was arrested, and he was put into the prison, Salemba prison, and I started trying to visit him there. But we were not allowed actually to meet him. It was a very difficult situation. There were a lot of women outside the prison and a lot of men inside, but we were not allowed to meet our husbands and so on. And then a little later on, my husband was released and then rearrested, then released. It was kind of in and out, and I was always trying to get him released. But then eventually in 1968, that's 3 years after that, another incident happened in Central Java, and somebody came to the house and started interrogating me, and I didn't know what it was about. So he said, well, I think you have to come along with me. I said, what is it? Is it just for overnight, or should I take some clothing or whatever? No, he said, never mind, we won't be long. So they pushed me into my husband was, actually at that time he was in the house, but he'd just be one of the releases, he'd been released. He was in the house, and of course my daughter was saying, Daddy, why don't you go away? They don't know about you. But in fact, he came out. So when they took me, they put me into the truck. He also came into the truck. They drove us to a building in the outskirts of Jakarta, and when I got to this building, they put me into a room. It was a room maybe about as big as this, not very big, and there were 8 women, no bedding, nothing like that. And he said, get down on the floor, get down there. So I stayed in that room with these women for about, I don't know, a couple of weeks, lying on just a tiled floor. We had no bedding at all. Very soon after this incident, this terrible incident, Sukarno, who was actually still the president, he was deposed by Suharto. He was not actually killed, he was deposed by Suharto. And Suharto took over complete power. It was a very devastating situation because under Sukarno, the situation was pretty democratic, not completely democratic, but anyhow, he was a very charismatic figure and very, very popular. But of course, there were problems in his regime. There was a lot of corruption, especially with his wife and so on. There was a lot of corruption. But the human rights violations were just a few. I don't know. There was very little happening in that way.
All of this was planned and coordinated with the United States. These were not events that just happened accidentally. They wanted to overthrow Sukarno.
Not myself. I I know the US supported very much what was happening, and they provided, for example, they provided lists of people that they thought should be arrested. The extent of the involvement at that point of the US, I'm not quite sure. I think it certainly was supporting the takeover, and very happy to get rid of Sukarno, because Sukarno had come out very strongly against, what is it, imperialism and the West and so on, so they really wanted to get rid of Sukarno.
Now, I've used the figure 3 million killed. Is that an accurate figure?
I don't know how many. I mean, it's, some people say 500,000, people say more than 1 million. The exact figure, of course, will never be known, because so many small villages and so on, which were said to be under the in favour of the PKI, many of these villages were completely uprooted and destroyed. And so to get any idea of the exact number of people who were killed is impossible, because it was just a huge massacre.
You were the only British woman in prison there.
No, at that point, I thought I was an Indonesian citizen because I was married to an Indonesian. That turns out to have not been true. After I had been held in prison, a lawyer came, he was trying to help me to get out. And also, the women who I shared imprisonment with, they also thought if I could get out, I would go abroad and it would be good for them. It would help them to draw attention to what was happening. And so I came back to London, and this is where we started organising a campaign. At that time, we called it the British Campaign for the Release of Indonesian Political Prisoners.
How did Suharto manage to wipe out the third biggest communist party in the world?
Well, he had the military. You have to understand, in every village, everywhere in the country, they were the military, they were soldiers. So if anybody protested, they would be killed or put into prison.
But did the communists fight back?
It was very difficult, because at first they tried to go underground and do some activity there in central Java. There was a certain movement there. The Indonesian Communist Party was not prepared for this. They were thinking that they would, if they tried to get political power, it would be by the ballot box. They were not interested in an armed struggle. They thought they could win through the ballot box.
Do you think that the Indonesian people will ever achieve justice for the suffering of that period?
Until recently, it was very, very dangerous for anybody to get up and set up an organisation of this. If it were, for example, me, they knew that I had some connection with the PKI, and they would ban this organisation or make it very difficult. For example, there was an occasion I remember when a lot of women had been told that their husbands had been killed in a certain area and they were buried there. And so the women came along and they wanted to exhume them and take them and give them a decent burial, which is what every family would want to do. But they were attacked by a whole group of a big Muslim group, and they had to, of course, they had to end this operation. They couldn't continue it.
Last question. Did you see the film, The Act of Killing?
Yes.
Was it a proper depiction of what happened?
Yes. Of course, the act of killing was showing the men who actually did the killing, and in fact, quite happy that they had done this. So it was, you felt, my goodness, what kind of people are they? There was such an ingrained hatred for anybody who was said to be, alleged to be, in any way connected with the PKI. They could just be bumped off. They were not ordinary people. They were inhuman, and they could be killed and do what you like. So the act of killing, you get that feeling. This fellow didn't think he was committing a crime. He was doing something good for the country to get rid of these nasty people.
Carmel, it's been an honour. It's been an honour to meet you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
On the topic of Palestine, Raymond Deloney says, a trail of tears thrust on defenseless Palestinians by murderous Zionists with the US cavalry blankets. And on the subject of the massacre of 1965 in Indonesia, takes response with a very, very powerful picture with the pretext, the US and Britain overthrow of democracy in Indonesia.
It is unbelievable the number of people who were murdered, but even more unbelievable that nobody knows anything about it.
Yeah, and that's all that we've got time for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.